So good morning, everyone. My name is Frank Place. I'm the director of the Policies, Institutions, and Markets CGIAR Research Program, which is hosted here at IFPRI. We actually conduct research on a number of areas and involve all the CG centers. And one of those areas is on the area of extension methods. We look at public extension systems, private extension models, other approaches, and specific tools and methods like ICT for conveying information on awareness and training to farmers. And I could say that the topic is not only alive and well in the program that I lead, but also within the CGIAR. So on the 23rd of October, we hosted a meeting with maize and wheat CRPs to look at scaling and what the difference, how the different centers are approaching scaling. And of course, extension systems and extension methods was a key element of that discussion. So there's a growing community of practice around this area in the CG. So it's a very important topic for the CG. But more importantly, I mean, it's an important topic globally, because now that the issues like sustainable intensification, resilient livelihoods, climate-smart agriculture, inclusive growth, land restoration, all these topics, all these big objectives that the world wants to achieve really depend on extension and advisory services. So I'm glad to see the coming together of this today, because it's a very important topic. The purpose of this event is to learn about novel practices in extension and the measurement of their impact, and to chart a course for the future of extension based on both innovation and evidence. Among much that will be covered, I think, in the next 2 days, we hope to hear ideas around the following questions. What are the implications for implementing evidence-based recommendations in more countries or at greater scale? How will we convince decision makers to implement successful approaches? And what are the research priorities for tomorrow's extension services based on existing evidence and on new developments in advisory services? Well, we have a great mix of people here to discuss this. You all have excellent experiences in this area, whether you're practitioners, researchers, policymakers, funders. We have assembled a very wide group, I think, that can inform those questions as we move forward. And I'm looking very much forward to the event and to listening to you during the discussions and on the panels. So with that short introduction, I think I'll turn it over to Kristin Davis, who will be the chair for the first session. Thank you.
Thank you, Frank. Good morning, everyone. It's great to see all of you here after these weeks and months of preparation. So this first session, we're going to have a keynote speaker, Florence Kondylis from the World Bank. And then after she speaks, I think we'll invite the three panelists to come up and speak after, so that you can see the slides and so forth. But I wanted to do a bit of welcome first and a few housekeeping items. First of all, we're not going to go around the room and introduce everyone. You're wearing these name tags, but maybe you could raise your hands and stand up if you're from the research community. Okay. How about people from, let's say, funding institutions? Yeah, okay, great. Practitioners? Yeah, there we go. Policymakers, anyone else? Did I miss anyone? Somebody who didn't fit in, patients? Commissioner of Agriculture? We'll hear from you. Yeah, so thanks very much. There's programs out there, printed copies, and also some materials if you want to pick them up. I think you should also sign the sheet. And restrooms are out this way to your right. We've got some hashtags and Twitter handles and stuff for those of you who are into social media. You can also get your photo taken out there. With the IFPRI board and so forth. But I think with that, let me just mention that we will be recording some of the sessions, this panel session, the session tomorrow morning, and one or two others. So just remember, your face might appear on social media, your comments could too. So if you have a problem with that, please let us know. But we will be broadcasting or posting the video of two of the sessions tomorrow. So this session is going from 9 until 10:30, when we'll take a coffee break. But with that, I'd like to invite Florence up, and looking forward to hearing your session. what do we do about these? Do we? Aha. Presentations. The PDF? Yeah. Okay.
All right, thank you. Yep. Sorry. Yeah, I just need to do it twice because it's full screen. Thank you so much for having me today. I'm really excited to be here with all of you and talk to you about the work we've been doing in this space of trying to provide evidence to improve agricultural extension policy. And so this is work that a lot of people who sit at the back from the World Bank, from the research group at the World Bank have contributed to, especially Maria Jones, who's there. So we started out this work in about 2009. At the request of our operations at the World Bank. You know, we've had a number of public expenditure reviews done by the bank in coordination with governments, and a lot of these PERs basically show you that, you know, there's a vast amount of money spent on extension services with little evidence in some cases of the effectiveness of this spending. And so the motivation, obviously, is going back to this well-known figure that every one of you may be showing today, and every one of you has definitely seen, that shows sort of the cereal yield progression across main regions of the world. And what is stark in this figure is sort of the slow progression of cereal yields in sub-Saharan Africa, especially. Most of the talk today is going to concentrate on sub-Saharan African extension systems with a little bit on South Asia. And so the progression of these yields across, you know, from the Green Revolution onward, obviously sub-Saharan Africa has not experienced the Green Revolution, it seems, from this graph, and we know it hasn't, whereas South Asia has experienced it, but there are parts of South Asia where we still experience low yields, and this may have to do with some climate degradation and other factors at play, and so we're going to talk about this a little bit today. And so the plausible hypothesis for this slow growth in yields in some areas of the world is that there are some constraints to adoption of proven productive technologies in these areas. And so we know that information matters. I think we know that, you know, extension services in India have been in large part responsible for the spread of the Green Revolution. But so the question is, how do we design extension services to address this informational constraint best? So how do farmers learn about new technologies is the main thing that we're trying to address during these coming 2 days. So we know from, you know, existing papers, existing studies, anecdotal evidence from the field that social learning matters. There's a huge literature on this. But how do we how do we leverage the fact that social learning matters? Well, the identity of the messenger may be really important in starting to diffuse a technology. So, you know, there's a sense in which productive, successful technologies are going to spread themselves, right? And so the question here is not so much how do we spread technologies, but how do we spread technologies faster, I guess is a better way of saying it. I mean, if something is good, people are going to end up adopting it. The question is, how do we speed up this process? And so there's some evidence that human capital of the first seed adopter is going to matter in this spread, and there's evidence that choosing people to demonstrate who are closer in their farming characteristics to others in the community is going to matter. And so we're going to talk a little bit about that. But there's also a sense in which experiential learning, so you yourself experimenting with the technology, is key in your decision to adopt this technology. And so we're also going to speak to that issue today, showing some evidence on these two channels, so social learning and experiential learning. And so the question for this audience, I think, is can we take seriously evidence from this research that tries to isolate the mechanisms of learning so that we design better extension services? So asking questions such as who should demonstrate and how many farmers should demonstrate. This is basically the big questions in extension policy. And so what we're trying to do, our setup, sorry, I like emojis, so I went with emojis. So we have, the key assumption is that we have people like the CGIAR, scientists, and people in like local seed, production. For example, in Bangladesh, at the Seed Institute in Bangladesh, we have people who know exactly what varietals or what technologies are going to be most productive. They've shown that in the labs. They've shown that, you know, on small on-farm trials, and we know we have good technologies out there. And then there are farmers who are cultivating in the real world and need to adopt these technologies. And so extension services basically are trying to make this link by using extension workers on the ground, right? And this takes a variety of shape and forms. I mean, we have, you know, as was mentioned, private, public. We have people who are doing agribusiness and providing extension on the side, contract farming. Sorry, so there's a lot of shapes and forms. I'm going to just simplify it to this simple little case. And so the first thing that we did when we started this agenda was to ask the question, is information getting lost in this network of extension? And so that's what we did in Mozambique, studying decentralized network of extension. And so the assumption here, to go back to the figure, is research flows from technology adoption flows from researchers to extension agent, and then from extension agents to contact farmers. This is the typical, you know, training and visiting model that people have used. And then the idea is that these contact farmers in the communities should be training other farmers on the technology. And so the problem with this modality of extension is that it may not actually address informational inefficiencies and accountability issues. And so in Mozambique, this was a question, is this model working? We have this model in place. Is information getting lost in this network? And so what we did is we ran a randomized control trial. We shocked the network, this network of extension, with a new technology, which was sustainable land management technology. It was mostly peat planting. So we have a bunch of peat planting papers in the world today. And then we provided direct training to our contact farmers in a random subset of villages. And the other villages, we didn't do this direct training. We just let this decentralized network function and hope for the best. And what did we find? So from this RCT, we asked two questions. So does information perfectly travel from extension agents to contact farmers? And then does information in the form of demonstration actually increase adoption in the community? Right? So these were very basic questions. And so the answer we got to these two questions was no. And the first question, so adding a direct training really increased the amount of demonstration in the community. So that meant that in the absence of this direct training of contact farmers, the extension worker wasn't really getting demonstration going of this new technology, right? And so there was a large increase in adoption by the contact farmer and demonstration activities by the contact farmer from having this centralized training bypassing the extension worker. So this is nice. This allows us to look at the impact of the technology at the level of the contact farmer. We find it to be productive, best cost efficiency. Just by looking at yield increases at the contact farmer level, this whole intervention paid for itself. But the problem is that this increase in demonstration had no impact on other farmers in the community. So this is work actually with an IFPRI colleague who's at Arizona State now, Valerie Mueller, and another colleague who's did her PhD and now he's at Precision Ag, working with Michael Kramer. But so what we find is that there's no impact on others. And so demonstration, what this tells us is that demonstration of apparently a profitable technology doesn't get disseminated to others. There may be accountability issues there, that this contact farmer might not be really teaching others in the community and so after that, I mean, actually it was at the same time, but as we were studying this in Mozambique, we also started some projects in Malawi. Some colleagues started some projects in Malawi, trying to really, experiment with this accountability problem. So what can we learn from different modalities of interaction between extension and farmers in improving this adoption within the community of this proven technology? So this is, again, some peat planting papers that some co-authors wrote. And so what they did is they ran two different RCTs to test these different modalities of implementation through another type of decentralized extension network, which was very similar to the Mozambique extension network. And they asked two questions. One was, can performance-based incentives boost adoption? And the other one was, can leveraging social network speed up the rate of diffusion of a productive technology? And so I'm going over this very quickly. Obviously, the papers are long and complex, and a lot of you have read them, I'm sure. But so the answers were yes in both cases. So incentives double the impact of this, training of contact farmers. And yes, closer socioeconomic proximity or network centrality in the village really increased the diffusion of this technology, of this same technology that we diffused in Mozambique. And so, you know, there's no, I mean, we can't compare this context, but just for the record, I mean, these are pretty similar agroecological areas in some sense. And so it's quite interesting for the same technology to find such stark differences. Now, on the incentive, I think what's important to say a few words about is that these incentive schemes are actually really hard to implement at scale with government extension programs. And so in Mozambique, we were trying to experiment with an incentive scheme, and we just were never able to get it off the ground. So this was our city that we run with our partners on the ground, IPA, and we were able to implement, so Maria actually spent years implementing this with IPA on the ground. And so it worked. I mean, it got done. But when we tried the same thing through the government system without IPA, just on its own, it actually never took off. So I just also want to caveat that I think this is a really nice way of isolating mechanisms of accountability and what can help overcome accountability issues, failures in accountability. But I'm not saying that this can be scaled up overnight very easily. I guess these are different issues. Similarly, figuring out who's central in a social network isn't so easy, right? So, you know, there are people who are trying to think about, you know, gossips or things like that, but there's still a cost of figuring out who's central in a village. And so this is going to lead us to think about another way of overcoming these constraints. We run some RCT in Bangladesh to ask the question, you know, given a certain amount of demonstration resources, so this is in the case of climate degradation in Bangladesh. People are trying to move from paddy growing in the borrow season to growing things like, you know, lentils, other paddy type of, other types of paddy seeds that are a little less water demanding, mustard, anyway, I'm forgetting some things, but basically mung is the main crop that's being disseminated to replace paddy. And so it's kind of moving, you know, pre-Green Revolution in Bangladesh, lots of people were growing mung in the borrow season, in the dry winter season. They moved out of mung into paddy, and this project was trying to move them back into mung. This is a huge government effort. And so, you know, to promote these new seeds, these new varietals, of course you have to distribute some seeds. And so the question was, given a certain amount of resource available for, you know, this distribution of seeds, how do we spread this demonstration resource within the village? Who should get to demonstrate? And so to learn about this, we embedded a field experiment in this large government extension program in southern Bangladesh. And so our interest was really, you know, this was after we had results from Malawi and Mozambique, and so we were able to kind of think iteratively about these issues and think about, okay, to make this feasible, to make this social learning really feasible and optimal in the absence of, you know, money to run a full social network mapping, etc., what can we do? And so we randomly varied the number of experimenters across village to learn about the optimal allocation of the resource under a fixed allocation. So we didn't, it's not like more is more. This is a story of we have a fixed package and we're distributing it differently. And while doing this is interesting for policy, we were trying to also build a little bit of theory at the background and try to think about what is the relative role of self-experimenting relative to social learning in this context. And why this is important, and I'll go back to this in a little bit at the conclusion, is I think combining these RCTs and some theory, some learning theories, is going to be key in trying to build, you know, some external validity of these findings. I mean, obviously what we find in Bangladesh is not applicable in Malawi. But if we're trying to, if we use theory and we try to back out some important parameters of these learning models, we can actually learn something that's a little bit more applicable outside of these specific RCTs. And so we estimate a structural model of experimentation and learning in networks. This is still ongoing research. Maria and another colleague, John, we're still working actively on this. So this is the experimental design. You have the regular demonstration set up with the one guy getting the big packet. This is somebody that's been designated by the extension worker to be, you know, the best receiver, the best seed for this work. Then we entice 4 different farmers. So this is all done in, you know, a meeting with a big farmer group, a group of 25 farmers, where people get to volunteer for this role. So we're not forcing anybody into this. So then we find 4 farmers who are cultivating sort of plots that are contiguous to demonstrate together. And the idea here was to hold constant, variations in conditions. So we didn't want these guys to have 4 different plots in different conditions. We want to hold constant the fact that we're only demonstrating on one local condition, so that the regular and the shared are directly comparable. The only thing that's changing is the number of seeds. And then the last arm that's quite different is we tell the group, hey, we have so much demonstration resource. As many as 12 of you can go out and demonstrate. Okay? And so we have, and this is a group of 25 farmers, so it's as many as half of the group basically are demonstrating. And so this is the main result is basically that what we find is that so allowing people to self-demonstrate, to come forward and decide to demonstrate, increase adoption twice as much as regular or shared demo. This is the year after the demonstration year. So this is, a year after these demonstration activities have ended. And this is not about, more people have more seeds. I mean, we also see these effects on the actual amount of land under cultivation. They're less precise, but we see that the amount of land under cultivation also goes up, the share of land. So it's not about, more people got the seeds and they're just reusing them over time. There's actually a crowding in of investment. And so the key takeaways from this work is that encouraging farmers to self-experiment increases the pace of technology diffusion by about 58 to 76%, depending on the specification, relative to no demonstration. The gain observed under the more traditional model of demonstration is half as large as this. We kind of back out the role of learning externality in this adoption to be about 41% of these variations in this variation in adoption. And we think that estimating learning externalities from experimentation imply that the optimal extension allocation has many more demonstrators than the traditional extension model. So we're still working on this, but this is kind of the main key takeaway. I'm going to skip this slide for the interest of time. So what did we add after this? For all this work, we started to wonder a little bit, okay, this work is nice, things are going up. But our farmers really demanded this extension work. And so in many settings, especially when the extension workers are not really disseminating a new thing. So in a lot of this work, it was like, new thing. Okay, bright and shiny pit planting, bright and shiny new seeds, things are moving, fun, But in a lot of the extension systems that we're studying, there's nothing fun and new. It's all, are we doing row planting? Are we doing intercropping? Are we doing pretty basic stuff, right? And so in this world of pretty basic stuff, are farmers even showing up at this extension training? And if not, why not? And so we worked on that. The Rwandan government was particularly interested in these questions at the time of this experiment. So in 2012, when Agnes Kalibata was the minister, she kind of, 1 acre farms penetration in the country was starting to really take off. And they were really, interested in the model and kind of considering, okay, maybe we move out of public extension altogether and we just sign a big MOU with 1 acre fund and we stop this public extension business. So that was kind of the conversation. And so at the time we got involved, and with our colleagues at 1 acre fund, we started doing focus groups on what are the issues with this model. I mean, if we're going to scale it up, we better be sure that this model is actually serving all farmers. And so from these focus groups, and then some actual data, collected data that you guys would like to look at, not fake data from 3 farmers, but real data from a large area of the country, we found that about 37% of men attended such training and much fewer women. So it was on the order of 18% of women. And what was stark about this is that a lot of people actually de-adopted the 1 acre fund membership. So from 1 year to another, there was a large amount of dropout of the membership. And so, the 1 acre fund model is somewhere where you're paying for the credit, and the credit is financing this extension work. And so as a farmer, if you don't see returns to this extension work that you're getting, and after 1 season, you're less credit constrained because your yields have gone up a lot from adopting these nice inputs, you may not need the credit anymore. And so you may disadopt this service altogether. So that was kind of the thinking behind this. So, the minister, 1 acre fund, everybody started to think about accountability. If farmers are not finding this useful, it may be because the training is not really good for them. They're not finding what they need in this training. And so we started to basically propagate some scorecards to farmers, asking them how they felt about the quality of the training they received, whether they had gone, and whether the quality was good. And we also opened, so these scorecards were done in many different ways because the interest was to have something that was quite scalable in case of results, of positive results. And so we also opened a hotline. That was the cheapest way of doing this, that farmers would just dial in to provide feedback. Versus these scorecards that were, done on tablets in the village, and anyway, and then we had group meetings. We had 3 different treatment arms, and they all kind of did the same thing. If anything, the hotline worked better and was cheapest, so was actually scaled up to not only Rwanda, the whole of Rwanda, but then Kenya and Ghana. And the cost effectiveness of this RCT is like clear. I mean, the cost of doing this was super small, and because of the scale-up decision that followed, this was a cost-effective impact evaluation. And so the effects were really stark from just having the access to this scorecard. This is pulling across, oh no, this is not pulling, this is scorecard versus logbook, but basically you see the number of users dropping out going down, and you see the number of new users joining the group actually going up. So this spilled over to other farmers in the locality who may have thought, oh, 1 acre fund's not for me, these guys are not listening to my needs, and actually people started to join in. So these effects were large enough that that people wanted to really scale them up. Attendance in training was increased, and particularly for women who caught up to male attendance. So basically, we started to have just gender equality in attendance in training. So what's the implication? I mean, the context of a private extension system, feedback tools increased attendance among current users and sign up among non-users and reduced dropouts. We do a bit more in the paper. This is an academic publication by now. We show that this is not about anchoring expectations, that farmers may not have known what they should expect, and suddenly they know, and now they're happy. That's not what happened. We also show that this is not just additional monitoring. This is really coming from the feedback provision and not just having people watch over the extension worker. So we have a placebo treatment arm where we do that. And so what we suggest is that accountability appears to be a substantial constraint in extension networks. And this is not surprising because farmers know quite a bit about farming, right? And so they know quite a bit about what's going on in the field. They know quite a bit about what they want. And so giving them the ability to affect the quality of the training, the content of the training, I mean, this seems like a good production function to have in mind, right, when we design extension trainings. So I'm going to finish with a few slides on gender discrimination. And so when we think about women's participation in extension service, I think everybody who's gotten extension service data in their hands know that we see constraints. I mean, we see gender inequality both in the supply of extension services and the use of extension services. That's kind of a finding that the Gender Lab at the bank, the Africa Gender Lab, documents in a really nice study recently. And so what we have for evidence on this topic is the Malawi experiment that I described earlier, one of them, also tried to study gender discrimination in extension service. And we have some work in Mozambique to suggest some gender frictions in communication. I'm not going to talk about this, but this is work with also Valerie Mueller here. The other thing is to note as users, so I'm going to just talk about this first paper in this keynote, but we also have some evidence that as users, there's quite a bit of gender inequality. And so, for example, these feedback tools in Rwanda, we started from a baseline of much lower attendance among women, and the feedback tool really helped the women attend more. And so all the effect basically on attendance are driven by women catching up to men. And there's some interest in looking at gender-specific constraints to attendance, such as provision of childcare. I mean, women are really busy in the rural areas, so to the extent that these extension trainings are displacing other activities, there may be a need to help with that. Okay, so what can explain the gender gap in participation in extension service? So now, just looking at the supply side. So, we may be in a world where men and women have different innate characteristics. So it could be that I am not as good as, say, my colleague Paul at the back at farming, right? I may not just be as good. Or I may not like the idea of being out in the world teaching others about farming, right? So it may be something innate about women versus men. However, this may be shaped, and my preferences, this may reflect back in equilibrium from the fact that maybe people around me don't like me to teach about agricultural practices. Maybe there's a sense that people don't want to learn from women, or beliefs, right, that women are not good at farming. And these two things are going to do the same thing, that they're going to reflect back in equilibrium to a situation where women are just less likely to be involved, right? But it's interesting to know which one is at play. And of course, innate differences have been documented on things like liking competition or not, but we can never reject that these are just, an outcome in equilibrium of a fruit of discrimination, right, in the first place. And so what we did in Malawi to try to speak to these two different drivers of low participation in extension services is we randomized the gender of the contact farmer who was teaching others in the village. And so we had this comparison where we had female versus male, main contact farmer versus female contact farmers compared to, men only. And so what do we find? We find that discriminations, so we conclude from this study that discrimination is in fact a driver of the gender gap in participation in extension services. The way we do that is we find that gender reservation does not affect communicators' performance in acquiring, retaining, and applying information from this new technology, peat planting in this case. Yet we find that there's an attention deficit when the contact farmer is a female. And so farmers in those gender-reserved villages are less likely to show up at trainings. They're not paying as much attention to these women who are trying to teach them a new technology. And this is similar to other studies that have shown, in the case of, I think it's in the Netherlands, university students in the Netherlands don't think women teachers, women professors are as good as men professors, although objectively they're learning as much. And so we see exactly the same thing, right? That perception of women's performance does not align with their actual performance and their actual knowledge of the technology. They're actually as good as men, but they're much less valued. And what we find is this does not come from a general gender friction in communication where men and women are less likely to talk or less likely to talk about farming. It really seems that this comes from this role. So we see that from baseline to follow up, these women, before they are designated in this role, actually there's no gap in the perception of their farming ability. Once we designate them, they go lower. They go down. The perception just collapses. So it really seems to be something that comes from assigning them to this role, that just there's a distaste for this in the community. And so this is quite a nice finding. And so this is very depressing, but nice to know, I guess. And so this is not surprising then that these women are not coming forward to take over these roles because, they may suffer backlash in the community for taking over these roles. Yeah.
Does that hold for both men and women farmers?
Yes.
Value women presenters?
Absolutely, exactly. Yeah, it comes from both. There's no difference in this effect. Yeah.
I'm wondering about heterogeneity of age.
Oh, yeah.
There same issues for youth or among women of different ages?
Okay, so among the communicators, the designated communicators, there's no age gap between the men and the female communicators. So that doesn't come from whoever's empowered to lead this role. But on the recipient side, it could be. We haven't looked at that dimension of heterogeneity. We just look at male and female respondents, but not by age. But at some point, if we start sizing the sample, I think we get into power issues, but we could do that. Okay, and so it seems that some policy action. So the type of things that happen in India with the panchayat, having these women sort of reserving these roles, there may be some learning over time that actually these women are not that bad, and so these frictions in communication, we may actually be able to overcome this perception gap. But that's just what I hope for. Okay, so to conclude, I think we have ahead of us some great opportunities and challenges in designing extension models that make sense with the way farmers learn, right? And so there's a lot. Today, this is by no means an exhaustive summary. But I think there are some really promising, so I was doing some reading towards this talk, and some really nice research is coming out of using technology in disseminating these new technologies. so new technologies for new technologies, to complement this existing traditional extension system. So we have, some nice papers from Digital Green, Precision Ag, and so a lot of these guys are here in the room who are running this program, Digital Green particularly. And so I think this is really nice in the sense that if we think that there's an information gap, basically information gets lost in the network, this can directly address this issue, and I think that's what these papers show. Another issue that I think we should be thinking about, and we're starting to think about in the context of Mozambique, we're working with farmer field schools, with FAO in Mozambique, and trying to think about, measuring learning. So this is really hard, and there's a recent paper in the Journal of Human Resources by Rashid and Karin that shows that there's a lot of noise in measuring knowledge of these practices, and so we need to pay attention to that moving forward. And maybe doing kind of classroom observations, these kind of things could help a little bit, improve the measurements, and actually see which questions, which measures actually have content relative to a gold standard of, say, classroom observation. And what I really believe in is that RCTs and theories are going to be a really important technical complement in moving forward in this space. I don't think we can, have, as many trials as we need out in the world, although I think a lot of these RCTs end up paying for themselves. I think, most of those we showed today paid for themselves. And so I think I'm not super worried about this spending, but there's no bandwidth. I don't think the research community is quite large enough to study everything everywhere. And so, I think combining RCTs and theory can really help that way and get us closer to the efficient allocation of scarce government and NGO resources in this space. And so I think that's quite exciting as a research area. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Florence. I'm not sure if this is working, but I could push it and see if it works now. I was going to invite the panel up to respond, but I have a feeling there might be a few burning questions on Florence's presentation. If not, I don't see any burning questions. Ephraim? Let's just take a few minutes for a few. Let's keep them to like more sort of clarity on the presentation, and then we'll talk about the implications with the whole panel. Ephraim?
Asante. I'm surprised that even women sort of don't take very seriously the messages from the women extension agents. And I think if you conduct that study in areas where the majority of the people are Muslims, is not going to really, women are going to communicate with the fellow women very well. And I think the study that we did in Uganda actually shows the opposite of what you saw. So that's something which is quite interesting, that we found women were, they were more effective than men. In terms of convincing people to adopt technology, not reaching, okay, but convincing them to take up a technology that the extension agency is giving. And they were more effective in actually reaching to the poor people, farmers than the main farmer. So I think that those results are very context specific. Yeah.
No, I think that's absolutely right. I mean, even in Mozambique, doing something quite similar, we found that actually adding a woman communicator in villages where we already had a man communicator actually improved dissemination of technologies. So I think this is more like something, it's less about the effective, so this is a stark case where these women are just as good as men, not better at communicating. So we're not saying that they're worse. We're saying they're less appreciated. And if that's true, and the people who are making decisions, so even in the case where, they're more appreciated by women, are these women actually having a voice in who gets to demonstrate? So if most of the extension workers are men and they're designated who demonstrates in the village, most likely they're going to pick a man, right? So I think it's quite specific to Malawi, but at the same time, there's a bit of generality to this finding, which is in a world where women are underappreciated for their work, they're less likely to come forward and be the suppliers, right? So I think this may still happen in Muslim communities. And so then the point is really more, we do need some policy action to exactly reduce the frictions in communication if they exist, but even if they don't exist, kind of overcome this through reservation. But I don't disagree. Yeah.
What's your definition of that?
Learning from others. From anyone around you. So exactly, from anyone. Yeah, exactly. So in this case, we can't really shut down. So in all these cases, we never not have an extension worker. So there's always somebody, even in Bangladesh, in the areas where no demonstration happened, there was always someone, providing extension services and trying to promote these crops. So the only difference was really these demonstration modalities, but there was always somebody to learn from. And there were always farmers who were adopting these crops, even on a small scale. All these technologies were somewhat adopted at baseline. And so there's always a degree of learning from others. The only thing that we do is we increase it using an experimental design.
Okay, thanks. I think I'm going to invite the rest of the panel members up here. We have Patience Rwamigisa. Sorry I didn't give your full bio, Florence. He's the Commissioner of Agriculture in the Ministry of Agriculture, Animal Industry and Fisheries in Uganda from the Ag Extension and Skills Management Department. You can come take a seat. Are you going to present, actually? You're going to show some slides. Okay, let's have Patience present, and then we'll bring up the rest of the panel after his presentation so that you don't have to crane your necks. And when you do have questions, there are some microphones on the table I've just discovered. So 10 minutes.
Okay. Thank you very much. And I'm privileged to be here to share with you, as a policy practitioner, the issue of scaling up agriculture extension programs. And I'm the head of the Department of Agriculture Extension and Skills Management, the Ministry of Agriculture, Animal Industry and Fisheries in Uganda. And the idea of scaling up extension programs is very essential in the sense that agriculture is the main driver of growth in Uganda. And the transformation of agriculture from subsistence to commercial farming is a very key policy goal. And in Uganda, we have about 5.8 million households engaged in agriculture out of the 7.3 million households. And out of the 5.8 million households, almost 4 million households are subsistence smallholders. And that makes it a very complex system on how to transfer technologies to such a large number of farming households. And production of globally competitive agricultural products for export is another goal. And agriculture contributes on average for that 6 years, 54% of the foreign earnings. And when it comes to the other key policy goal is ensuring national food and nutrition security and increased household incomes. And our national nutrition studies show that almost 33% of the children born are malnourished and stunted. And the poverty levels stand at about 21%. That's basically the picture about Uganda. But in Uganda, over the years, we have undergone through the extension system has evolved over, and different methods and approaches have been applied from colonial times. And in colonial times, it was largely a regulatory approach and directed largely on cash crops. And after independence, government adopted the educational approach, established educational institutions, and the district farm institutes were established for mass training of farmers. It moved into participatory approaches. Most of you know the training and visit approach that was adopted over the years. However, in 2001 to 2014, I think David Nelson is here. He was the real driver of the National Agriculture Advisory Services. This program was well-intentioned, well-designed, but it was a demand-driven in approach that adopted a contracting model. The aim was really also to get rid of the public extension system that had been perceived as inefficient, bottom-up, and not addressing the real constraints of the farmers. But you know, along the way, after many years of almost more than 10 years of implementation, the model ultimately failed. It could not get so the model was terminated in 2014. And in 2015, government adopted a new extension model, going back to the public extension system, but which is pluralistic in nature, not somehow different from the previous extension system, which it is administratively decentralized, but technically supervised by the central ministry. And this system we have adopted is flexible to allow different innovations. Here we can see it is the Farmer Field School in Eastern Uganda on rice. And down we have been working with IFPRI on doing some video-mediated learning in extension. So we have been conducting some work so that we can build evidence, see how we can improve the system. And what can be learned from NADS regarding the scaling, the NADS approach? What the scholarly work I did find why did this program, well-intentioned, well-designed, extensively consulted, but eventually could not succeed. And my key observation was that there was a clash in core beliefs between domestic actors and international actors. And this clash in belief was not well, during the design could not be observed, because what happened was the political and administrative systems of government embraced the reform, but the technical did not. And so there was some slow, silent boycott, which persisted along the way, and eventually started manifesting itself when the program started failing. So there was actual lack of consensus and domestic ownership in the design and implementation. And what was one of the key assumptions that was made was there was a critical mass of private service providers, which actually was not the case in reality when the program came to implementation. And the weak capacities of farmers to own, pay, and control the service. And one of the other issues was the scaling out of this program ran too fast compared to the institutional capacities that existed. And the scaling was partly, the rollout quickly was partly engineered by the political demands. So which never gave the program the opportunity of experiential learning. So the other aspect was the enterprise approach that the program adopted left many farmers out of service provision. And in the process, made the program increasingly become unpopular because many of the farmers had been left out because it adopted an enterprise approach, and farmers who did not belong to those enterprises could not participate in the program. So the majority of farmers actually were left out. And the emergence of, during implementation, because it had been assumed that the public extension staff would be laid off and go to provide services in the private sector. But that could not happen because these extension staff at the local level were providing services beyond extension services. They're providing regulatory services, providing the planning for local governments, so they could not be laid off. And therefore, there was an emergence of parallel institutional arrangements that were now in conflict, that eventually, ultimately affected the program. And what lessons can be derived is that, from our experience, that consensus building is key, but also is very difficult to achieve. You require a lot of patience to get this consensus on how to move things. The ownership of the program by domestic actors is important, and capacity assessment of the primary actors is very essential. So whenever we're going to design programs, it's very important to first do the capacity assessment of the primary actors. So what are the key features of the new approach? The extension reform that we adopted, it is pluralistic with a mixture of demand-driven and supply-driven approaches. Because what is observed is that there is a small section of emerging farmers who are commercial, who can demand for services. But the majority of the smallholders are subsistence, and they don't even demand. So so therefore we had to adopt a system that has a mix of supply-driven and demand-driven. So the system is private sector mediated with options of contracting service providers. In other words, this public extension system where particular specialties are needed, there is a provision for contracting out. Then providing broad services, all this was learned from the previous, that we needed to provide the broad services, but with a focus on the priority commodities that government has identified to promote for commercialization. Strengthening linkages through, we have now strengthened, because one of the issues we observed was there was very weak linkages between research, extension, and education institutions. And all of them were working in isolation with not complementing each other. So we have tried to strengthen the relationships of these institutions by signing memorandum of understanding between extension, research, and education institutions, so that each of them will play more of a complementary role and avoid competition. And the policy clearly has the core element of being farmer-centered in planning and implementation. And what we have also done is that we have a harmonized system of developing extension materials, which we have put in place, because different actors were developing different materials on the same subject with different messages. And in the process, there was confusion. So we have put in place a system that now harmonizes extension materials, and every actor that wants to develop a material as applied to the ministry, it undergoes a peer review of that material, and they agreed, and then the ministry endorses it and puts on its logo as the material that should be used by all actors. And then currently we are developing the National Agriculture Extension Bill and to repeal the NADS Act, so that the institution compliance can be integrated in that bill and can be achieved. So what have we achieved in the last few years? One was we designed a system where you had to put, first of all, we agreed we need to put a regulatory environment that enables pluralism to work. We had to put in place a delivery system, and we had to place in also getting a beneficiaries organized. So we have created the public extension system. We agreed that we would create a lean public extension system that works in that pluralistic setting. And our target was to have at least a minimum of 5,000 in the first 3 years. And we have so far recruited about 3,800. And we have undergone through refresher training. And additionally, we have government had to put in money. We have procured vehicles and motorcycles, because these are the issues that public extension system was craving for, that no transport, no facilitation. And we have also created an agriculture extension conditional grant that annually, that stands at $10 million, supported by the government of Uganda, so that there is a permanent system that is well facilitated, that can now work in partnership and collaboration with other actors. And one of the issues, because of public accountability, has been one of the key problems of public extension service. So what have we done? What are we doing? Because we realized that was a very critical issue. So we have designed some tools. We started with a paper diary, which is a diary of extension workers where they have to record all their daily activities. But now we realize that it is also abused, because even monitoring it is difficult. So we have now designed the e-diary, which we are now piloting in a few districts, which and it has proved is proving to be very effective in monitoring and giving real-time evidence of what the extension agents are doing in the field. So we have also developed performance assessment of extension managers, and annually we bring them together and show how they are performing and rank them in terms of how their performance is. And we have the Ministry of Agriculture is doing a lot of regular visits to follow up with what is going on in the field, and we have also instituted the regular annual audit inspections of that extension grant to see how it is being utilized and corrective measures being instituted. And we are conducting also joint inspection with other ministries, joint led by the Ministry of Public Service, and we have put in place now strict measures to protect. Because what was happening that even when you give these equipment and whatever at local government level, the local politicians can take over these and start using them. Eventually, they are not utilized. So what we have put in place is that we are putting very strict measures that even at any attempt to take, by a political head, to take a vehicle of an extension staff at the ministry headquarters, we can even impound it using the police. So we have put in place very strict measures to ensure that these people are able to have the facilities, they give them that and they use them. So how does the new extension system approach the challenge of scaling? We have also come up using these new approaches to reach large numbers. As I've told you from the beginning, the numbers are very many. The ratio of extension staff to work is 1 to 1,800 households. So you have to come with innovative methods of how do you approach. So we have come up with the multi-stakeholder innovation platforms, and these ones are proving to work very well with the commodities that are already commercialized. Knowledge management and advisor hubs, we are trying to work with the different partners. Interactive radio programs leveraging on FM radio networks. We have about over 150 FM radio stations, and government has put in there is a provision that they must provide at least 2 hours per week for government programs. So we're leveraging on that. We are now planning to set up zonal learning centers, including e-learning, for informal education and mass skilling of farmers and value chain actors. And we are strengthening collaboration with research organizations. Karin University, we are working with National Cultural Research Organization, the University of Hohenheim, IFPRI, and other non-state actors. And so these are innovative approaches also to scaling up programs. We have the traditional commodity farmer group approaches, the farmer-to-farmer extension approach, the parish model farmer. This is similar to what you are discussing, but this one we have modified it in a manner that it addresses our interests. It's a presidential initiative, but we have technically studied it and modeled it in a manner that it addresses the needs of the farmer. We have the nuclear farm model, which promotes the producer public-private partnerships, which has worked well with some IFPRI funding, but it requires a lot of capital investment to work. The village agent model with USAID. But what is important with all these models is that once they are proven effective, we see how we can integrate them into higher curriculum of high institutions of learning so that students are exposed to these models. And we're working with the Food and Agriculture Organization to promote the farmer field schools because there is sufficient evidence that it really works. And therefore, we have partnered with the universities in Uganda, the agricultural universities and the agricultural colleges to see how we integrate it in higher institutions of learning. So, you also asked that what kind of research areas do we need to look at? We thought the issue of inputs is a very critical issue, and we really need to come up with how these effective input delivery models in view of the political economy that surrounds these inputs. What kind of models do we study to ensure that we are able to get a system that fits within the political setup that exists? So we need to do that. Institutional innovations that can strengthen research, extension, farm and industry, and the ICT innovations that can increase technology uptake, climate-smart agricultural technologies, and the potential of producer public-private partnerships in scaling up agricultural programs. So in conclusion, I would say set only 5 things. One is that consensus building for reform is absolutely essential. And therefore, whatever program we design, building consensus on how we get things done is very important. And the timing of these reforms is also very important. Ownership by local government is very key. And this program, this current reform has proved to be the ownership is so strong at local government that it is even the local governments that are now more of our advocates in getting things done, and the non-state actors. Then building capacity and accountability at the same time. Because the capacity, from our experience, the local capacity, we adopted these reforms as a cocktail. At that time, there was privatization, liberalization, democratization, all were coming at the same time. Now, when all this came in, it became very capacity levels to absorb all this was very limited. And therefore, that's why some of these programs could not take root. So advocacy by non-state actors also has proved very essential in promoting our reform. So thank you very much.
Thanks very much, Patience. So we've heard some fascinating research on social networks and incentives, gender. We've heard from some of the reality on the ground of implementing by policymaker. I'd like to hear now also from Karin Lyon from Digital Green. She's the Vice President of Strategy from the implementer side, as well as Carol Jenkins, the Office Director for Agriculture Research and Policy of the Bureau of Food Security. You guys can both come up, as well as Patience and Florence. Let's finally get our panel together now that we have half an hour left. And Carol, you were going to go next if you want to make some remarks from your perspective, and then Karin, and then we hope to have some time for questions as well. So over to Carol. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much. Good morning, everyone. I've had the privilege and honor to serve the United States Agency for International Development over the past 20 years as a Foreign Service officer or in some other capacity. I've spent the majority of this time in the field, and so I've have the benefit of seeing multiple models of extension, where they've worked, where they face challenges. And what I'd like to do is just bring 2 specific examples here today and just discuss those. So these are coming from Nepal, where I was most recently serving. And basically, what I'll do is I'll outline the problem. Currently, the problem was that in Nepal, there were several rice millers who were facing challenges. They were starting to process, they needed to process medium to fine grain rice varieties, where the only thing that was being grown in the country was the coarse grain variety. So they were trying to be responsive to the taste in the market, and yet there wasn't the supply in country. So as a result, they were bringing in the majority of their paddy rice for processing from India. The farmers were not growing coarse grain rice, number one, because they didn't understand what the market demand was. They didn't understand that that's what the demand was within the millers. They did not have access to quality inputs, and they did not have the technical skills to be able to shift to this new variety of rice. They're also risk adverse, which we know with working with farmers. So as a result, the rice millers were purchasing the majority of their rice from India. They didn't know who they were purchasing from. They were reliant on traders who would charge anywhere from 10 to 15% for the delivery of the rice paddy. So enter the USAID funded activity. It was a Kisan activity, which is an acronym which actually means farmer in Nepali, which is one of our better acronyms that we've come up with. But it is implemented by Winrock International, and they began working with the rice millers. They worked with them to develop their business plans, to assess the market, to really start to develop a brand where they were actually coming up with a brand for that medium fine and fine variety rice varieties that they were looking to enter into the market for. They also, our USAID activity productivity, then worked with the rice millers themselves to begin to build that relationship with the farmers, to provide the farmers with the support that they needed in order to shift from this coarse grain variety that they were traditionally growing and had the skills to grow to this medium fine grain variety of rice that would meet the demand. So the rice millers, basically, they were providing the technical training and the inputs on an affordable credit scheme to the farmers. They taught them the agronomic practices so that they could actually increase their productivity. And they were willing to buy everything that was grown by these specific farmers. The other thing that they did was they paid a premium. They paid more than they would get on the coarse grain, and they also paid a premium for this partnership. So the results in this specific example, and of course this is very short, but I do think that we had some excellent examples. So part of the key finding was that the relationships between the miller and the farmer were formed. People knew who they were buying from. The farmers understood who their purchaser was. It was, in some cases, some of the millers told me it was the first time they had ever met any of the farmers who they were actually buying from. So this was a major shift in the industry to start to understand who your producers are and where your production is being sourced from. The millers were buying directly from the farmers. They were no longer paying that 10 to 15% commission that was with the aggregator. So that reduced the cost of their inputs, as well as allowed them to pay a premium back to the farmers. The rice millers were starting to form their own brands and be recognized and get market recognition within, for example, one happened to be a Sahu rice miller, now has their own brand of the medium variety. So they were starting to brand themselves and trying to get more market share within the local market. In this one specific case, one miller was working with 2,400 farmers. And these farmers tripled their earnings in rice sales. The other thing they did, and for me this is one of the most impressive one, is that the farmer production increased by 1 ton per hectare. So they were able to increase the productivity of the farmers by providing them with this technical assistance. These are the findings from the first year of operations. And we were working with that was within one miller, but we were working with multiple millers across the country to be able to provide this service as well. I think this also really leads itself to the focus of USAID and our transformation. We're trying to engage more in the private sector. We're trying to look more at those opportunities for the journey to self-reliance within countries, and we feel that the private sector plays a significant role in that. So by USAID playing that facilitative role, we were able to create the connection, have the private sector provide the services rather than it coming from USAID, and build those relationships that we feel will have a long-term impact. So after the program is completed, that these relationships will continue because it's between the miller and the farmer. So that's one specific example that I wanted to share. The second example I wanted to talk about was within the Integrated Pest Management Innovation Lab. This is being implemented by Virginia Tech University, Virginia Tech. And it is working with IDE as well, and they were looking at a last mile delivery service of IPM technologies. They were mostly focusing around Tuta absoluta, which is a tomato leaf miner. It's a devastating pest that was really causing a problem within the tomato production within the country. The activity itself performed on-farm research and demonstration sites. They provided substantial private sector involvement in IPM tools, as well as trying to strengthen the supply chain. And they were using community business facilitators to provide that last mile delivery of the IPM technologies. These would include pheromone traps, neem, screened houses, and other approaches that they were using. The community business facilitators, they were entrepreneurial farmers They were based in rural communities. They received training on the IPM technologies, and they also received a commission on the sales from the agri-dealers. So by getting these technologies out to that last mile, they were taking them out to the rural areas, delivering them to that last mile, providing the technical assistance, and also being able to sell the actual the pheromone traps and some of the other technologies. And we felt that that was a good model for delivery of last mile services. This specific example, we had 156 community business facilitators. 42% of them were women, and 45% of them were coming from historically marginalized communities. I don't know if any of you know the Nepal context, but you know that this is social inclusion is a huge issue for us, as well as gender inclusion. The activity itself reached about the overall, not just this component of it, reached about 51,000 farmers who increased their income, annual income of about $225, which is a significant amount when you look at the farm earnings within Nepal. The community business facilitators earned an additional $76 annually on average. Again, this does not seem like a lot, but in the context of Nepal can make a significant amount. One of the most significant pieces of this that I appreciated with the approach is the fact that the empowerment of both women. Women were perceived as a leader or someone who is knowledgeable on the IPM technologies and as someone who they could go to for expert assistance in addressing whether it's the tomato leaf miner, or other pests that they could assist with coming up with solutions. So all in all, this was provided that last mile delivery to that trusted, by a trusted community member. And those are just two examples of how we can engage private sector. Again, the hope is, with this type of structure, again, USAID playing that facilitative approach, that as the programs and activities end, that these relationships between the agri-dealers and these community business facilitators will continue and will have a lasting impact with the resources and the activities that we engage in. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. I first like to thank Kristin for this opportunity to be here, contribute to the conversation, and especially being on this incredibly impressive panel. So I'm hoping to actually build off of one of the points in Florence's earlier presentation and her conclusion, that bullet that said, there are promising developments leveraging technology to complement traditional extension systems. And I love the use of complement as opposed to replace, super important. And also trying to give some of my reflections from my perspective working with Digital Green as an implementer to address one of the questions that Kristin actually posed to this panel as well on how to use technology to improve extension but not see it as a silver bullet. So based off of the work of Digital Green in Ethiopia and India predominantly. For those who don't know, Digital Green is an international NGO. We're focused on strengthening agricultural and health extension systems using information and communication technologies to empower rural communities and create more demand-driven systems. We began with this community video approach over 10 years ago, wherein we work with existing extension systems, public and private, to train existing frontline workers on how to produce and disseminate videos that feature members of the community and are hyper-local in their content. We train the frontline workers in human-mediated facilitation to improve this adult learning experience, so really employing those tenets of social learning, experiential learning. And we use handheld battery-operated projectors to mitigate these connectivity challenges. We also train the frontline workers in data collection from the farmers they're engaging with, so that the frontline workers, our team, the superiors of these frontline workers can analyze the data and make course corrections in their work in near real time. Over these last 10 years, we've layered in other ICTs, such as radio, IVR, other mobile-based channels, And our data management system has also evolved. We call it COCO, Connect Offline, Connect Online. It is a digital MIS that our partners input their field data into. And then that allows our team and our partners to visualize that data so that it can help us understand who's being reached, what content they're watching, what are they adopting, what feedback they may have. This community video approach has been institutionalized across both the Indian and Ethiopian government systems, reaching over 1 million farmers and 13,000 frontline workers in India, and about 450,000 farmers and 5,000 frontline workers in Ethiopia. And as a result, more than half of the farmers watching these videos adopt at least one improved technology or practice. So across both these systems, the governments have contributed more than 20 million total across both to embed this community video model through equipment purchase, staff training, and even policy change. But ultimately, the way that we view technology and this approach is that technology tools have served as enablers for higher order outcomes that we believe a strong extension and advisory system needs to have. These technological solutions that we've developed and others are our version of like a Trojan horse that is relatively straightforward to embed within a system, but in actuality, it's a catalyst for more systemic change. And this systemic change that we really hope to promote, to encourage, to facilitate is about emphasizing not just reach, but rather adoption of practices and really the quality of that adoption. Frontline worker capacity building and performance management of those individuals, including incentives. Establishing formal farmer feedback loops that really get entrenched in the system and inform how the system runs. Collecting near real-time data and analyzing it so that feedback can be used to course correct. And ensuring that content is demand-driven and relevant to farmers. So these are all tenets of our approach that video really has been the catalyst to help push those tenets. So technology, in this case, starting with video, has really been the enabler for these higher level outcomes in both the Indian and Ethiopian system. And we've seen access to extension increase through the use of digital technologies. We've seen adoption increase, yield and income increase. We've seen more dynamic and customized content being produced that farmers are demanding. We've seen governments incorporate near real-time data into their decision-making processes. All important things. But technological solutions do need to evolve just as challenges evolve in these systems. They need to be dynamic and adjust to the changing needs of the system, of the farmer, of that frontline worker. And if we don't continue to ask ourselves, okay, what problem are we trying to solve now? What are we trying to address now? We believe you will get married to that one technological solution, and which will likely become obsolete. And you do run the risk of having that silver bullet mentality rather than seeing the technology as an enabler of an evolving and dynamic system. So now, after more than 10 years of working on the community video approach and adapting and evolving it and tweaking it here and there, at Digital Green, we're asking ourselves this question: what problem are we addressing right now in the face of these changing systems, the future of extension, very much to the theme of this conference? And how can technology help address that? Not solve it, but help address and facilitate that. And one thing is pretty clear to us, to me, is that extension and advisory services, whether public or private, are sadly going to continue to be underfunded. I really believe that no matter the advocacy, no matter the evidence that's produced, it's just one of those elements in the agricultural system that will continue to be underfunded. And I think there's probably not enough money out there to really build and maintain strong public and private extension and advisory service systems globally. Today, a frontline worker is pretty much expected to know everything and provide all kinds of services to farmers. It's a pretty unfair and unrealistic ask. We know that not one single person, not one single organization can address all of what a farmer needs to enable her aspirations, given just the sheer scale and diversity that exists. Each organization has a comparative advantage of some kind. So the question we're asking is, how do we optimize everyone's roles? How do we optimize the system's finite resources so that this 1 + 1 can really equal 3? In Ethiopia, for example, there are nearly 4,000 non-governmental organizations providing some form of extension and advisory services. 4,000, I mean, I can't even comprehend that. We're one of them. And each organization tackles one part, or maybe even overlapping parts, of this complex problem of extension and farmer productivity and food security. With little coordination between them, each organization uses our own approach, our own systems, our own knowledge base. And in that bargain, farmers can suffer. There can be provided information and services they don't demand, they can't use, it's not really relevant to them. At Digital Green, we do believe that technology can be an enabler to bridge the divide across these organizations between them and enable this coordination of our work to better serve farmers. Too often, these organizations, our organization, we're collecting data about farmers, but we end up being the only ones who benefit. We as the organization. The farmer doesn't even necessarily benefit. And oftentimes, I think we don't recognize the richness of the data we may have. But data is super critical. It's critical for a farmer to know what she needs to do to improve, for instance, her soil fertility. It can enable a frontline worker to learn what's working or what's not by actually understanding what's happening with the farmer she serves. It can be used by a bank to offer farmers credit based on how well they're doing. It can provide traceability to a buyer across their supply chain. So data can enable these and many, many more use cases that my imagination doesn't even know how far it can go. And so at my organization, Digital Green, we are exploring how technology can bring these data together and into the hands of farmers and their service providers. So we're investing in the development of a digital platform that we call FarmStack to support this coordination, to more effectively, cost-effectively provide customized and coordinated information and knowledge through multiple digital channels, and make connections across the value chain that otherwise didn't exist. So it's this integration of data, content, knowledge across channels, across different actors, across the value chain. And I hope to share more in a later panel about that. So in closing, from community video to this concept of data interoperability, technology has played a really important role in the work that Digital Green has done and that of many organizations. But we can't overemphasize its ability to solve all these challenges alone, and it must continue to evolve as the challenges do themselves. Thank you so much.
Thanks very much. You guys are going to have a chance for some Q&A now. We're running slightly behind. But one thing I'd like to comment is how interesting that there's many themes running through the talks, but this idea of relationships. We heard about it with the social learning from Florence, with the consensus building that Patience mentioned, the issues of trust in Nepal, and then just community video, you know, those relationships in the community. And of course, extension is all about relationships. And so that's a really interesting thought. But I'd like to turn it over to the audience now. If you have comments, questions, please raise your hand. Let's take a few comments and questions and then give a chance for response, and maybe just state your name for those who might not know you. Are there any questions or comments? Paul, and then Stanley, and then Gary. This table is going. Okay, go ahead, Paul.
I'm struck by sort of a disconnect between the research at the World Bank and sort of the economics research, a lot of concern about identification and all the things you're doing in RCTs, and then Patience's talk at the policy level in Uganda and his emphasis on political economy issues. I'd like to ask at the bank, what are you thinking about in terms of political economy and the governance issues that Patience raised in his talk? And how do you see the research agenda in that domain, which I didn't hear much of in your remarks?
Can we collect a couple of questions? Is that all right with the panel? Okay, Stan, you have
I want to ask a question about first Florence's presentation and then the ones that follow. Florence was talking about from researchers to extension people to farmers, all things going one way and not the other way. And the other people talked about working with farmers. And I think there's a real issue associated with making sure that we understand what farmers are thinking and then try to bring that in a loop back to the researchers, which is actually what almost all the three other people talked about in some way. But I think it's very important.
Thanks. Gary, do you have a question or a comment?
Yes, and perhaps my comment comes down to being the same as the others. In Florence's presentation, it seemed that all of the programs were technology transfer, sort of predetermined technologies being pushed, which during Green Revolution was the extension approach that went out of vogue and was widely criticized later on, with much more attention to participatory extension approaches and demand-driven extension. So there's a whole question there of which the relative emphasis between the two, and I thought Uganda nailed it with saying that you need a mix, that's probably appropriate. The other part of that, though, and I think this came out in the recent Digital Green Review of USAID's extension activities, and that is the technology that's being promoted in technology transfer programs. For the USAID programs, the technologies being promoted were often quite vague, in contrast to the Nepal example, which was very clear with a clearly defined technology, but a lot of times it was vague. Sometimes it would fall back on line planting, which I have doubts as to the farmer impact in that. And so I think there has been a weakness in evaluating the technologies and whether they're appropriate to farmers. That comes to the research link and support services for extension services.
Thanks. Do you guys want to take a chance to respond here? Who wants to start? Thanks. Just push the
Thanks a lot for these questions. They're great. So I think on the political economy side, I think there's quite a lot of attention at the moment, for example, on the input provision side of things. So I think the bank is supporting a lot of e-voucher systems, and the view is to move, for example, from paper to things that we can actually check with data to limit leakage of this type of programs. I think on the extension system, it's a little more limited, right? Because I think, as was presented, sort of the platforms for accountability that governments have are still building up. So I think the Ugandan case, I was really interested to hear about. I don't work in Uganda at all, so this was really interesting for me to hear what's happening with the new public system and how trying to close these accountability loops. So I think we've seen more of that in the private type of extension provision. So with One Acre Fund, the work was really on the accountability of the system, right? These feedback loops were really built to build this accountability between farmers and extension, right? And so I don't actually see a big divide. I think, what we mentioned, sort of the RCTs, the power is to look at mechanism by mechanism, what are the limitations of these models. And I think I saw a lot of commonalities between the research we had from the ground from non-Ugandan context to the Uganda presentation from patients that I actually saw a lot of commonalities. So I don't know, patients can comment on that. So I think the overarching theme through the other comments seemed to be a little bit, the weakness in technologies that are actually being promoted to farmers. So, as economists, we do believe that farmers are profit maximizing, right? So they're not going to adopt bad technologies. So, or they will for 1 year and they will disadopt. So I think, sort of acid test of are these technologies profitable or not, I think we should trust that farmers know what's good for them. Okay, so I think when we do a technology trial and things don't get adopted after 2 or 3 years, I think there's probable cause that those technologies are not good, or there's some market failure somewhere that prevent these technologies from being profitable. And this is something we see in Rwanda with irrigation. Irrigation is hugely profitable for farmers who have a lot of labor on hand, not so profitable for farmers who don't and have to hire labor in to produce these really labor-intensive crops that are horticultural crops. And so I think there's a bunch of examples from the literature that tell us, non-productive technologies are not getting adopted beyond the adoption year, and that's great. I mean, we should trust farmers. I think we should trust farmers more to make decisions for themselves. And, reading the data when something doesn't get adopted, that unless we have some real sense that, for example, on the input market, there's a lot of quality issues, right? So it's not that fertilizers are bad, it's that fertilizers that are sold are bad. And so, and farmers are quite sophisticated about this. I mean, I think farmers actually know what's profitable for them. So I don't think any of us is trying to claim that, certainly not, it's a technology to farmers and then, we should push things. Not at all. I think we have technologies that have been studied in the lab, they're being promoted, but we don't actually know whether they're profitable in the real world, right, sense. And so I think these trials are both trials of, are these technologies good? Are farmers keeping them? If they are, can we learn about this diffusion process? But I don't think we can learn from bad technologies. So I think we do need to make a good effort at promoting technologies that we have probable cause on. But I think these trials are really contributing to building the evidence on the profitability of these technologies in the real world, outside the lab. So I see this as quite complementary. I don't know if I skipped something, but I think those were kind of the big questions.
Maybe if I may compliment, I think what I have also, from the practical point of view, is that market failures, which is so widespread across all these agricultural enterprises in Uganda and Sub-Sahara, really they affect even technology uptake. And also I think the issue of technology evaluation of performance of these technologies has been limited. Recently we are undertaking, reviewing the National Cultural Research Organization technologies, and we observed there was a certain variety of maize that had been developed, which was popular with the researchers because they were very big grains, and the farmers. It was also popular because in terms of volume, to produce big volume. But when we interacted with the millers, it was very unpopular. And then we went ahead to interrogate why. Why is it that this? Then the millers were able to tell us that, when this variety, when you in terms of meal flour, it is less productive. So and it was then that we realized why we had nobody had ever gone to evaluate about this kind of technology. So, and in the process, because of its low meal flour, which the millers who offer the market to the farmers were not taking up that. So the farmers were resorting back to the original grains they were using. So somehow it's very important that as we even develop these technologies, also to evaluate the performance in the field, and also to see the different users of these technologies, what are their perceptions. Probably the other issue is that when I observe most of these projects across Africa, they are supply driven. Even this World Bank, most of them are supply driven, with a little, and because you find institutions that are in a physical crisis, they need money to run, they simply embrace in order to keep going. But I think it is also important that in future programming that the World Bank also takes into context and does more extensive consultations when we are designing these development interventions.
No, I think that's right, and I think this is really the power of doing this iterative learning programs where we're not just there for one season looking at one technology. It's a one-shot game, and then we all go away with our research. We have a paper, it's nice, but really keep being involved. So for example, in the Rwandan case, with my colleague Maria, who's here, the World Bank co-financed a large hillside rehabilitation program that's called the LWH program. Now it's in its second phase, and there's actually a new program underway that would use this model. But within the impact evaluation, so this is a 7-year at this point old impact evaluation effort that started when the program started to roll out. We didn't know what technology, we didn't know much. So the One Acre Fund program came out of this, the evaluation of these feedback loops from farmers to extension, because we didn't know whether this was going to be a promising model for the country. So this was a request from the minister. But this was a request that came from farmers, in the sense that from focus groups with farmers, we heard there were accountability issues with the system. So now we fast forward to now, we have results that, as I was mentioning, these irrigation schemes that have been built on the hillsides, adoption is not complete of this irrigation, meaning that farmers who receive irrigation are not necessarily using it. And this, we think, is because of a failure in the labor market. So wages, the clearing wage is way too high for farmers to be able to hire in labor and turn up a profit. So if you have a big family, you can use all your labor and you can produce these labor-intensive crops. If you have a small family, you're not going to hire in this labor, it's too expensive. And this really goes back, to the idea of shadow wage of these farming families. And so the next project is trying to, hearing from these lessons, is trying to promote labor-saving technologies in irrigation. And so I think this is really where it becomes productive. It's not so productive to say, oh, this is the problem, and we go away. The production function really requires a long-term engagement where we have all this learning, all this adoption of better behavior, and this iterative learning, even at some small margins that end up making a huge difference, right? And so I want to be more positive, but I do think that doing a one-time trial isn't, the best use of this research. I think the best use is when we're really invested in the context and we can try a lot of things and inform policy in the long run.
I think there's a question at the back.
Hi, good morning. I'm Jane. Before joining USAID earlier this year, I was living and working in Uganda for 10 years. And I'd love, Patience, if you could also speak to your comments through the lens of young people as buyers and sellers of extension and other related activities in the context of one of the youngest countries in the world. And also, I think one of the most startling things I heard from the panel was your comment, Karin, that pluralistic, public or private, we will never have enough resources to pay for extension. That's very scary. So the question for the whole panel is, what's the aspiration here? Is it a resilient system that deals with complexity and shocks and stresses? But if it's utterly hopeless in terms of something sustainable, it's hard to reconcile the idea of something that is absolutely so essential that no one's willing to pay for or can't be paid for. So where are we on this? How does this mix in Uganda, how is it going to get paid for over time? And where are we going with this?
Okay, let's take one last question. Maybe you have one too? Okay, 2 more questions and then we'll discuss the coffee break negotiations.
Thank you. David Nielsen speaking. I wanted to pick up on this point that several people at that table made about the balance between the supply or top-down, technology-driven, or farmer voice demand for things. I also picked up on that. There was one point in one of your slides, Patience, where you talked about a balance between the two. And I think Gary's right that some of the discussion around this extension has come from very sort of what we now call top-down approaches to kind of went to how can you have a demand-driven system. And now, I think it's very interesting to see that you're expressing the need for balance between professional judgment together with farmer experience and judgment in determining what extension works on. So my point is, or my contribution is, I think it still is quite weak how you get good content on the supply side of that balance. I think that's been really hard to achieve, where we continually bring good content that's useful, that would be interesting, that's professionally proven. How to get that as a continuous input to people working in remote areas, thousands of people working in remote areas. Many of those people they're not PhDs, but they need to be conversant to, at a technical level. Having a system that does that systematically has been difficult to achieve at scale. And then on the demand side, I think how to get a system that really is demand driven, that really it reflects farmer voice in an organized, good way, in a way that helps to bring accountability to the system. That's also been difficult to achieve at scale. I think we continue to be in a situation where we see some examples of handling those issues on both sides kind of nicely at small scale, but we've really struggled to figure out how to get a system that can do that at large scale. That's one thing you're doing, trying to do, Patience. And I think that's a really important part of the discussion about what's the future that we're looking for, and can we get resources to do it?
If there is time left, Patience, I also want to ask you to elaborate a little bit on this multi-stakeholder innovation platform. When in one of your slides about how to reach large number of farmers, you mentioned the multi-stakeholder platform as one of the mechanisms. I think in relation to scarce resources, etc., in this context, it's also nice to know what are the efficient ways to reach farmers, and you've given quite few examples, and one of which was on this innovation platforms, if you could explain.
Okay, thank you very much. I think we should not be pessimistic about raising resources for for extension, because what we have observed is that I think largely in Africa, extension has been externally funded for a long time, and convincing governments to put money in extension has been a big problem. And what we did in Uganda was we decided that, okay, we have taken up this new reform, and therefore we are not going to seek, as a Ministry of Agriculture, we are very clear to government that we are not going to seek external financing. We must first raise resources internally to finance this system, and then we can now leverage on external financing to continue supporting the system. And we did a lot of policy advocacy. And because our policy was extensively consultative, the ownership even by non-state actors was very high. That even it is the non-state actors who actually made advocates to Parliament to make sure that we get financing for the reform. So currently, government is financing 100% of the extension operations at local government. The resources may not be enough, but at least there is you see an effort that has been done by locally to raise resources, which you can now leverage on by getting now external financing to complement. So I think that if we change our advocacy strategy, we can be able to raise money from within government budgets to finance extension. The issue of balancing, the supply and demand. Here we have, the supply and demand is also determined by the needs. Now here you have 4 million households who are only on survival. They are not thinking, even before you even think about commercialization, they are first thinking of meeting their immediate needs. So what do you do in those circumstances? So, and this is within our real domain to think, how do you first, you need to first liberate them from their basic needs in order for them to think about demand-driven services. So we have, but at the same time, we also have within the same communities, those that have reached some certain levels of commercialization using the same enterprises, and they are demanding for those services. So in a way, you can leverage between what is being locally demanded to also to design what can be supplied. In that way, you can do it. But the issue of scaling, doing this, because when you do these technologies and at small scale, they look very impressive. But when you go into large scale, the results are different. So what we have tried to do now is that our country is designed into 10 agroecological zones. And in each of those zones, 9 of them we have an agricultural research and development institute. And so as what we have done now is in order to promote, because we must promote technologies that are locally validated to meet the needs of the farmers. So we are doing a lot of investment in these zonal agricultural research and development centers. That's why we have provided a proposal now to government to establish learning centers in those zonal agricultural research and development, so that, including e-learning, so that we are able to start generating knowledge and technologies. They become the knowledge hubs and facilitate technology diffusion and innovations. So that is what we are doing. But also, on the other hand, is that the farmer institutions are very weak, because the cooperative movement in our country collapsed some years back. And getting the strong farmer, because the extension cannot function without having very strong farmer institutions. But the challenge we are facing is that you have farm organizations that are weak, that can easily be potential candidates for elite capture or political capture. So how do you now? We are looking at how do you what kind of investments do we need to do to build these farmer organizations to be able to hold me accountable? Because that is the other aspect. Because currently they cannot hold me accountable, the way in which they are in. But what do we need to do to build these farmer organizations and even other value chain actors to be able to own these processes, and then can also put me to check that what I'm doing is not right? So that's why I think our thinking should now shift. Because in the current state of affairs, actually, it is very difficult to make extension services efficient in Africa. Very difficult, once these farm organizations remain as loose associations. The other aspect I think I've not answered, the multi-stakeholder innovation platforms. Yes, originally they started under National Cultural Research Organization. But the way originally they were largely for generating technologies, and it was conducting needs assessments of these farmer needs in order to generate technology. But along the way, they have undergone some evolution as we started developing value chains. Now, what we have observed is that the platforms under coffee, because coffee has remained relatively a stable commodity with a reliable market. So we have observed that these multi-stakeholder platforms under coffee are very strong. And actually the coffee stakeholders are more empowered than other enterprises. And this gives us hope that the more if we are able to get all the other enterprises joining into the market, then we shall be able to build these innovation platforms to be strong, and also an evolution of stronger farm organization. That is our hope, because because of all of you know, the food demand is increasing, and even within even our regional markets, the food demand is increasing, meaning that even these traditional food crops are increasingly becoming commercial. So we hope that if we are able to build on those efforts, we should be able to build now strong value chains that now that eventually these farm organizations become more and more strong, being represented on these multi-stakeholder platforms.
And we should break.
We're going to negotiate about that.
Yeah.
So just 1 minute.
Sure. If I could just add to those great responses. And Jane, I'm glad you asked the question. I was hoping actually to spark some feeling about my comment. And you know, I have a more global look. So you know, the story in Uganda is really amazing, and it takes advocates like patients to really push that envelope and make that a priority in the country. So amazing work that he and his team have done. In terms of, I just think it's a more practical, realistic way of looking at a dynamic system. So in the past, maybe, you know, generic curriculum was enough for farmers potentially. I disagree with that, but let's give that. Some of these like cost-saving measures that one would do in a system of having like generic, like one curriculum could have been enough. But the system is so dynamic now. Farmers have very personal needs that differ from the field next to her because of climate change, because of soil changes, all these things. And so everything that adds complexity to that system adds cost. And so I think we are not able to keep up with these increasing costs on like a global scale for what's really needed to address all the diverse needs that farmers have, that frontline workers have. Even in the US, talking to extension workers here, you can tell how strapped they are resource-wise. So I think, and another issue I believe with the resource thing is budgetary allocations at government. You need to be able to give an analysis of like what the trade-offs are. And with extension, I think it's incredibly difficult to assign costs and understand costs, I should say, and understand cost effectiveness of one choice versus another in extension in particular, because there's rarely like an extension budget. It's always part of something larger, some other program. There's different definitions of it. We talked about this a bit earlier. And so if you can't make those budgetary trade-off analyses, how can you tell a policymaker you're going to get more bang for your buck by investing here in extension? I think the aspiration that you asked is optimization of resources. So across partners, you know, public-private, assigning who's best placed in which roles, sharing data, being open about what you have, what the services are, that type of thing is the hope that we're trying to push for.
Okay. Just a few comments. I appreciate, Karin, what you were talking about. And I think it's important for us to think about, although we are talking about agriculture and we're talking about extension services, the countries where we work are looking at competing priorities across health, education, across many sectors, not just within agriculture. So these decisions are being made at a higher level related to what are the trade-offs even on a broader scope than what we're looking at now. So I think that's an important component to remember. I think that just a few thoughts related to looking at the potential for private sector and where there is the opportunity to see what we can do to leverage private sector investment in extension services. Where's the space for them versus where the private sector, public sector is? How can we maximize the investment on each and use it to really get real results? I think the one challenge and the one frustrating point that I've had after working in the field for so many years is just looking at productivity levels. When you look at rice productivity in Nepal versus rice productivity in Thailand or in any other country in the region, it's extremely frustrating when you come in at 25% below the regional productivity rates. So can we prioritize around certain things? I think it was a question around the vagueness of some of the interventions, but at the same time, there are certain characteristics and certain things that can be done in order to increase productivity rates. So I think there's a balance, there's an opportunity in that area, and I think we have a huge, tremendous opportunity to really get the private sector more engaged and leverage public sector resources.
I think in terms of aspirations, I think it's clear that currently in those economies where yields are very low, you know, we're in a situation of disequilibrium. And so sort of when we think about the rural transformation, we don't just think about extension systems, right? We think about extension system and factor market, like the freedom for factor markets to actually operate. So we're thinking about land, labor, and kind of the flow of productive labor flowing to the, you know, poorly utilized land. And so I think for us as World Bank, I think what we want to think about is really supporting these processes of structural transformation through this factor market sort of reinforcement, right? So creating the enabling environment. And when we do that, the hope is that extension systems are not going to have to scale up. They're going to have to scale back, right? And so, you know, you think about the US, right? The way, you know, so you think about very rich economies, yields are super high. There's no extension system to speak of. I mean, there's a little bit with the land grant, you know, model, et cetera, but it's not prominent, right? And most of the R&D happens at the private sector level. Farms are very homogeneous in size and, you know, technologies, same in Europe. And so when you look through these kind of scales of development, ultimately everybody's converging to that, right? The question is, how do we get this convergence process to speed up? And so I'm not that worried. I think we're in a situation of disequilibrium where these investments have to be made, but in the long run, you know, that's not going to be an issue. And so I'm pretty hopeful.